Let's do this thing as well to get it out of the way. I want to watch this. I'm a fan of the Garrett Shire. Is it Sheer or Shire? 1 in chat if it's Sheer, 2 in chat if it's Shire, 3 in chat if I'm yapping and it's none of the two. Okay, now you're all just spamming 3. Now I'm not sure if you're serious or not. Just Fi? Maybe I should just say Fi. Anyways, these videos are pretty cool. Competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Analysis videos. Very interesting. I believe this one, just from the thumbnail, I haven't seen it yet. This probably refers to the finals between Hani and Jesse, which was, I remember there was some interesting points in that final. Let's check it out.
Many a player will complain that their opponent had the perfect hand, and while yes, this does happen, there are ways that you can minimize the risk by quote-unquote playing around cards. Take, for example, Pacoat Permunsa at YCS Las Vegas in 2024. Here in Game 1 versus Kamal Crooks, he has pushed through multiple different hand traps while going second and has the ability to unleash a full combo. This sequence would start where he can go into Hida the Fire Charmer to take his opponent's Snake Eye Ash from the graveyard. This frees up his monsters to summon Snake Eye's Flamber's Dragon from the deck, and then completely knock out Kamal from the game. However, with 1 remaining unknown in Kamal's hand, there is still a chance for a card called Nibiru the Primal Being.
The way these players are talking about the math, it's critical. There's going to be no mistakes if you're very decisive to make sure the life points are correct. Oh yeah.
So he simply makes IP Masquerena, staying underneath the 5 summon limit for Nibiru the Primal Being to activate. The only way in Pac's mind that he loses this game is by getting hit with Nibiru and then Kamal top decking a live card. Kamal did top deck an absolutely live card in the form of Bonfire, but the last card in his hand was just a Droll and Lockbird and nothing like a Nibiru the Primal Being. But that's Yu-Gi-Oh! It's a game all about unknowns. While it didn't matter in this case, in the small percentage that it does, that is what separates many of the good players from the great players. Card games in general are a lot about trying to make predictions.
That is a very good point in general, is like, and this is one of the biggest things that you need to get out of your system if you want to improve at this game, is people will look at scenarios very, very, very often, and they will make a decision to play around a certain card or not play around a certain card. And then if the card is there and they played around it, they think that their decision was correct. And then if the card was not there, but they played around it, they think it was wrong, right? They will look at it, or they make the decision to not play around the card, and then the card is there, and then they think it was wrong, right? They use like whatever it's called, like results oriented thinking, confirmation bias, whatever, which is a very, very big thing that you need to learn to deal with and not think that way. Because only if you make the decision to play around a certain card in a certain spot, that decision is either right or wrong, independent of if the card is there or not, right? Because what you have to look at that point is the odds of the card being there, rather than the actual reality in that one situation, right? Because if you're in that spot over and over and over and over again, you want to make the decision that wins more often than not, right? You want to make the decision that is more likely to win you the game, right? And there's a lot of different things that play into this scenario, right? It can just be the pure popularity of a certain card in the game right now. Like if you think Nibiru is popular in a certain spot and you have the option to play around it, then you might want to do it because Nibiru is popular at the moment, right? If Nibiru is not popular in a format, then playing around it can be incorrect because it's not like that your opponent has it, so on and so forth, right? It's very, very there's a lot more to it than just playing around the card and then it's not there and then you think that was wrong, or you do not play around the card and then you get hit with it and then you think that was a misplay. That is not the case very often, right?
What your opponent potentially has, and then finding the correct sequence, solving the puzzle to play around or through them. Or maybe if you don't have the tools to play around or through, you have to bluff your way through it. So flashback to what some consider to be the greatest YCS final of all time. It's between 2 absolute legends of the game. It's Jesse Cotton, a prodigy back in 2019, multi-YCS champion with over 30 premier event tops, and has just begun his comeback to top-level competitive play versus another prodigy in Hani Jawari. Now, yes, I did make a previous video on this exact match, but I felt like there was a moment in that video that didn't have its justice done right. Tearlaments is a graveyard-centered deck whose main focus is to send cards from their deck to the
There's
graveyard.
one. I remember this. I remember watching this. There's one very specific moment. I think I know which one he's referring to. That is really, really interesting. That I think a lot of people didn't pick up at the moment. In that moment, I think that's. I think I know what he's referring to.
Be it adding cards from their deck to the hand, from graveyard to the hand, even sending more cards from your deck to the graveyard, even allowing cards that shuffle back monsters as well.
Sounds like it's very similar to mathematically correct play in poker. Sometimes making the decision to call on your opponent is correct when in reality they have the nuts. Mathematically you win 9 out of 10 times, but there's it's very similar to that. Yeah. It's a very good comparison.
Well, but the most important thing is sending Tearlaments monsters, who when sent to the graveyard, allow you to perform fusion summons by sending monsters from your graveyard back into the deck. And how these games typically transpire is that both players need to activate cards that send cards from both players' decks to the graveyard, which suddenly allows both Tearlaments opponents to start conducting fusion summons at the same time, leading to very complex game states where there is a lot of skill expression to navigate through. Games 1 and 2 are more swifter blowouts. Jesse in Game 1 can hardly get his engine started on his turn 0 versus Hani's Onslaught. In a combination of poor mills from Jesse and some good discipline from Hani to back it up, where he understood that Jesse's mills were poor, he constricted Jesse's plays, and then a perfectly timed
Jesse milled so bad in that
ends
moment.
The game essentially on Jesse's own first
in that
turn.
Game 1. That Game 1 was so...
Hani has his own Herald with discarding Diviner.
Jesse would barely give Hani a chance to start his own turn before he picked up his cards and admitted defeat. In Game 2, Jesse is finally able to push through multiple different hand traps and doesn't even give Hani a chance. Hani's interruptions are just simply not enough to stop the good mills from Jesse, and so Game 2 is a lockup. And like every good final, it always has to go to a thriller Game 3. As we've seen in Games 1 and 2, the Tearlaments Mirror Match is all about the first turn of the duel. One of the wild things about Yu-Gi-Oh! Is just how much interaction can happen with both players during either turn.
Yes.
Just because it's your turn doesn't mean your opponent needs to sit back in their chair and watch. So this is where all the marbles are. So in the back and forth on Hani's first turn, both players need to mill each other in order to play with the two monsters, Yugioh and Kelbeck. Each monster has the same effect to mill 5 cards from each deck. This will allow Jesse to actually summon monsters during Hani's first turn, assembling a Tearlaments Kaleido Heart and a Mud Dragon of the Swamp. These two monsters are going to be extremely annoying to remove, considering that, of course, Hani does not get a battle phase when going first. Surely these monsters will make it to Jesse's next turn, so where he could use them as follow-up material for a potential push to, come back into the game, right?
Triple attack, Stalin. He's going to take the Mud Dragon.
Yeah, that talents was crazy. Because Mud Dragon was actually insane in the Tearlament Mirror. Outside of talents, there was very little you could do to it, especially when your opponent, like when you can't attack it, like you needed a battle phase to deal with it essentially.
The Herald, the level 6 monster for Baron DeFleur. He's going to use Baron's effect to destroy Kaleido Heart.
And now he's warp speed, now that he knows that all the stuff's going to work.
However, Hani is able to break through with the last card held in his hand, a triple tactics talent to take the Mud Dragon away from Jesse, non-targeting, and make a Baron DeFleur and an Abyss Dweller to seize control of the game. Abyss Dweller being a card that shuts off your entire opponent's graveyard for the entire turn. As you can see, that's very important in a deck where 95% of its effects probably activate in the graveyard. And so Hani, for 4 turns, is able to loop Abyss Dweller, even able to recycle it back into his extra deck and summon it a second time. But somehow, despite all of this, Jesse is able to stagger along and prevent Hani from ending the game. There is still Yu-Gi-Oh! To be played. On Jesse's first turn, he simply normal summons Tearlament Sharon to attack over the exhausted Abyss Dweller.
This was the first, I want to say, mistake, maybe? Because the Dweller detached the water monster, so it was 20... It would have been 2200.
And then he sets a known Tearlament's Crime, a powerful counter trap that will have to be dealt with. Simply said, Jesse passes turn. Hani here is forced to use his battle phase to attack over the Sharon because Crime needs a Tearlament's monster to be on Jesse's field for its powerful counter trap effect, and he recognizes that he simply can't play through this. Where in main phase 2, he completes the Dweller loop and recycles it into the next turn. So still under Dweller's graveyard lockdown, Jesse staggers into the next turn. He top decks Abyssal Serenir to stop Hani from building a new field on his own turn, and then the simple normal summon of Mudora is all he can muster. However, it's enough to make Hani have to consider the battle phase to attack over the Mudora, which can shuffle back cards from Hani's graveyard even while it's on the field. As play goes back to Hani, all he has playable in his hand is to switch his monsters to attack position and just poke in for damage. It is now the last turn of Abyss Dweller as we move over to Jesse's turn. Perhaps Jesse sees the light at the end of the tunnel, and this is our situation. So, Hani is on a set tier limit.
This is the situation I was talking about.
Dweller with no materials, with a single top deck in his hand. Hani's graveyard is empty of resources for himself, but most importantly contains a milled Bestial Magnamut. On Jesse's side, he has a tier limits Merly, a Bestial Serenir, and an unknown top deck in his hand, with a known tier limits Crime that's been set for these last couple turns. However, remember, Jesse's graveyard is offline due to Abyss Dweller. He cannot fusion summon this turn with the tier limits effects or gain any further resources, but he can push back the few remaining resources of Hani. A line that is available to Jesse is to land a Dark Charmer in order to take a Magnamut from Hani's graveyard, which allows its effect to search another Bestial monster during the end phase. This will allow him to stop Hani's follow-up plays, and then turn the Dark Charmer and the Magnamut into the link summon of a Sprite Elf. During Hani's next turn, this can allow him to summon tier limits Merly from the graveyard, and with his graveyard potentially back online, Jesse has a moment to come back into the game. However, in order to execute this line of play, Jesse needs to deal with that tier limit Soliac that is set, which requires you to control a tier limits monster. But the problem facing Jesse is he has to ask the question, what is the last card remaining in the hand of Hani? In the previous turn, Hani made no play extension with the cards that he had in his hand. He simply switched his monster to attack position and proceeded to the battle phase.
This is a very interesting spot, and I think this is going to be a very valuable lesson. And I do think that looking at it from an outside perspective, thinking about it for a little bit, I do think the way that Jesse plays here is not correct. However, under the pressure of playing in a YCS final, I think it's 100% understandable, and it's way easier to say that from an outsider position, like from a watcher's perspective. It is much easier, but it's a very interesting and in-depth spot.
If Hani drew a tier limits monster, it's quite likely he could have attempted to use the Soliac to negate the Mudora on the last turn so that he wouldn't have to waste his battle phase. But overall, it's pretty unlikely that a tier limits monster is in Hani's hand, and if there is one, it has to at least be something like a Sharon rather than a Merly, which could be summoned and start a milling bonanza, or a Havnus, which could be used on his own turn to really make things complicated. So with the fact that it's a tier limits monster in the hand kind of being a little less likely than not, we have to think about the potential dead draws here for Hani. If it was something like a Shuffler, it very likely would have just been normal summoned. If it's something like one of these Millers, it would probably stay in his hand. If he top decks something like a Soliac, there's no reason for him to set it face down. And so there are a variety of cards that Hani could draw here that could just sit in his hand as a bit of a brick. And now you can see how much paranoia one single unknown card can really put a number onto your opponent. So in this current game state, Tier Limits Rhinoheart has two effects. It has one.
Okay, so the situation
where
I wish they would just show the board more
onto your opponent. So in this current game state, Tier Limits Rhinoheart has two effects.
So the situation is the following, just to recap. There's a Rhinoheart that was not summoned from the graveyard. That Rhinoheart will not be banished if it leaves the field. There's a Rhinoheart, there's a Dweller with no material that has been activated this turn, right? Jesse has a Crime face down that Hani knows about. And Hani has a Soliac face down that Jesse knows about. Jesse's hand is a Serenir that Hani knows about, and an unknown card that he just drew, which was a Keldo. And we have just normal summoned the Merly, milled 3, which didn't matter because the Dweller was active, right? That's the situation.
It has one effect where, when it is summoned, lets you send a Tier Limits monster from the deck to the graveyard. And then the most important one here is that when it is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can summon itself back from the graveyard and send a Tier Limits monster from your hand to the graveyard. And the Tier Limits Soliac on field can send the Rhinoheart to the graveyard. which could therefore trigger its effect to summon itself back, then send a Tearlaments monster from the deck to the graveyard, then perform a fusion summon, and you could see where this line could get out of control. So if the card in the hand is a Tearlaments card, for Hani, it could come with devastating results, and Jesse needs to think about this. So let's return back to Jesse. He needs to attack over the Rhino Heart to turn off the Sulliek, and he has a Tearlaments Crime, which is able to stop the Rhino Heart from triggering. So Jesse begins by normal summoning Merlin. However, Merlin doesn't have a high enough attack stat to swing over Rhino Heart. This requires Jesse to commit his Bestial Sereneer from the hand in order to deal with the threat. In the battle phase, as Jesse attempts to attack over the Rhino Heart, Hani Jawari activates his set Sulliek, targeting Merlin. Sulliek is threatening to send Rhino Heart to the graveyard and trigger the...
So the play, I mean, he's going to explain it anyways, but I want to do it in my own words. The play that Hani is threatening in this situation is Sulliek to send the Rhino Heart, and if he has a Tearlaments card in hand, he wants to discard it to bring back the Rhino Heart and basically go ham, right? Because if he has a Tearlament card in hand, he can use that Rhino Heart to get everything going, right? He discards the Tearlament card, which probably has a graveyard in a graveyard effect, or it also the Rhino Heart also sends something, right? So you get like a ton of stuff going if there's a tier card in hand here. And so Jesse thinking like, okay, if he activates the Sulliek here, that probably means he has a Tearlament card in hand. So I'm going to activate the Sulliek to I'm going to activate the Crime to get rid of the Sulliek to make sure I can attack over the Rhino Heart, right? That's the thought process. Show me the board
litany
again.
of effects that we just talked about. Jesse elects to flip Tearlament's Crime to negate the Sulliek and shuffle it back in the deck while sending the last unknown a...
And this is a mistake, which you will see in a moment, the way it plays out. Because Hani, spoilers, Hani doesn't have a Tearlament card in hand. Hani doesn't have a Tearlament card in hand. And the reason why it's a mistake in this case, because normally you would say like, oh, you can't know whether there's a tier card in hand or not, right? So why is it a mistake here? Like it might not be, maybe it is, I don't know. The reason why it's a mistake here is, first of all, you can make an educated guess on a lot of Tearlament cards in Hani's hand that would have been used last turn. There's a bunch of them. Merly would have probably been normal summon. Scream would have probably been activated. Even Sharon could have been normal summoned to make something like a Time Thief Redoer, right? There's a lot of things that Hani could have done with different Tearlament cards in hand, right? The even bigger deal though is that you don't have to enter this mind game here. You don't have to do it. You can just let the Sulliek resolve. The Rhino hits the graveyard, and if the Rhino can activate, you know now that there's a Tearlament in hand, you can just crime the Rhino Heart in the graveyard. You don't have to gamba on whether it's a Tearlament in hand or not, right? Like you can just let the Rhino Heart hit the graveyard, crime the Rhino Heart in the graveyard, which has a couple of implications. It has a couple of implications because if you crime the Rhino Heart in the graveyard, you do not get rid of the Sulliek stays, and you also don't discard your shuffler, because if crime doesn't I think it doesn't destroy then, and then I don't think you have to discard. But Sulliek staying is a big deal for some stuff, but like the even bigger deal is that if there is not a Tearlament card in hand, then you just keep the crime. You keep the crime and you basically lock up the game, right? The thing is that this for Hani, you have to put yourself in Hani's perspective, right? Because when Jesse attacks this Rhino Heart here, you have a Sulliek that Jesse knows about, and you also know that Jesse has a crime. For Hani, activating the Sulliek is something that he always has to do if he thinks about it. That always needs to happen because there's you force Jesse to gamble, basically. You force Jesse to think about, is there a tier in hand or not? If you don't activate the Sulliek, your opponent just knows that there isn't a tier limit, right? And the only downside to activating the Salik is you take a little bit more damage. Even if Jesse calls the bluff, doesn't activate crime, it's not even a big deal. It's not even a big downside, because all that happens is your Rhinoheart goes to the graveyard. You don't activate it because you don't have a tier card, and then the Serenir attacks the Abyss Dweller instead. So it's just like a little bit more damage, and you lose your Abyss Dweller, which isn't really worth anything, right? It can even be a bonus sometimes because you make it so your opponent, like, you have no more monsters in that case, so your opponent's Bystials are not quick effects anymore, right? So activating the Saliek for Hani needs to always happen. He always needs to flip it, because there is a chance that it baits Jesse's crime. And it does here. It's exactly what happens. It baits the crime, which is huge.
Heldo the Sacred Protector from his hand to the graveyard. Afterwards, Jesse simply attacks over the Rhinoheart and enters into main phase 2. Once again, there is still a single unknown in the hand of Hani, and the flip of Tearlaments Soliek suggests that the last card is probably a Tearlaments card, because if Soliek sends Rhinoheart to the graveyard, you need to activate Rhinoheart's effect, sending a tier card from your hand to the graveyard. If this is the case, Jesse is completely back into the game with the line that we've just talked about. So you can kind of see how this web is potentially building together for Jesse. The logic and reasoning that this is still a Tearlaments card in the hand of Hani is building up. Crime's negation also just makes sense. He kills 2 birds with 1 stone. He stops the Rhinoheart from being able to trigger in the graveyard, as well as putting the continuous trap back into the deck. Jesse is still thinking ahead and tries to get the most value out of his cards. So with the decision made, in main phase 2, Jesse link summons into Dark the Dark Charmer and declares its effect, targeting Bystial Magnuma in Hani's graveyard.
So these two are becoming Dark the Dark Charmer. Oh, but his last card is Magnuma!
That's exactly what he needed. It's a monster on the board. It's going to give him another monster. All he needs is damage right now.
And that's just game. That's just game. So the last card in hand is just a Magnamud, right? And the thing that happens if Jesse just doesn't activate the crime is the Salik negates the whatever, sends the Rhinoheart. The Bystial Serenir attacks over the Dweller, and at that point, legitimately, your opponent has 1 card in hand. You have a Merly, a Bystial, a Crime, and a Keldo. You know your opponent's card in hand is not a tier card. You just pass. You just pass there, and you probably win the game. It still depends. The game isn't over, but you are in a very good spot because you have a live Crime. Your opponent doesn't have a Tearlaments card, so they need to like draw a normal summon that deals with the Merly. If they don't draw a normal summon that deals with the Merly, you have won the game. Because they don't have a monster anymore if the Salik resolves. Is this Jesse's first misplay? This is not Jesse's first misplay. We all misplay a lot, even the good players. It happens a lot. It's just like the difference is that we do it less often, but it happens to everyone. What a question is that?
That's it. Ruby summon, Druid's Worm,
Stare.
So it wasn't a Tearlaments card. Hani's discipline of holding the Magnamut during his own turn pays off. He could have attempted a similar play to Jesse, summon Magnamut, attempt to make Dark Charmer, but all that would do is trade with Jesse's Bystial and reveal valuable hand knowledge. If Jesse knew what the card in Hani's hand was, he could have continued to play it slow. He had the shuffler advantage in his graveyard, but when you see the light at the end of the tunnel, you want to give your opponent as little chances to top deck their way out of the game. Jesse saw a plausible line, but Hani...
Why wouldn't he summon Dark even with no Crime? Because then he loses in the exact same way. If he summons Dark, he doesn't have a Tearlament anymore, and then his Crime isn't live. So the exact same thing happens that kills him. If you let the Salik resolve, and the Rhinoheart hits the graveyard, and your opponent doesn't activate it, you know that the card in hand is not a Tearlament card, so it's probably a Bystial. And then he doesn't lose to the Magnamut because he can crime the Magnamut. He can crime if Hani attempts to activate the Magnamut, you can crime the Magnamut, discard your Shuffler, and that Shuffler can deal with any Tearlament follow-up that they might have.
Bluffed him right into it.
You just don't
Yugioh
make...
is a game of
you just don't make the...
If Jesse had simply let Soliek resolve and, you know, not negated it with crime or anything, Hani would have just sent a monster from his field to the graveyard for absolutely no reward. However, Jesse saw a line, but had his idea reinforced by the flipping face-up of Soliak and walked into one of the most valuable bluffs in Yu-Gi-Oh history. There are always a lot of could, woulds, and should here for Jesse. He could probably look back in this game and point out 100 different things that he probably did wrong or could have done better back then, but, you know, you kind of have to live with your mistakes sometimes. And so Jesse Cotton would go on to win 3 more YCSs after this event, all in the span of nearly a year. That's another thing. Don't let one loss get you down.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, folks,
That's the difference, right? There's people that get very discouraged from stuff like this, as opposed to people that just accept that it's part of the game and they come back stronger, right? Incredibly interesting finals, by the way. I encourage you to go and watch if you haven't watched the finals match in its entirety, it's very, very cool. It's a very, very good feature match. In that feature match, by the way, there's a lot of stuff I personally think that Hani could have done better. Because I think the only reason that this game was even this close is because Hani didn't play it that well either in the Telement Mirror. Like, I think he was focusing a little bit too much on Abyss Dweller when it wasn't all that necessary. Especially the second one, I don't think was... I think he gave Jesse a couple of ways back into the game. Like, the game should not have been as close, is what I'm trying to say as well. So it's not just a Jesse misplayed this situation. It's also this game was very, very close because I think Hani also gave him more ways into the game that he should have had.